President Trump's trade tariffs have signaled the start of his second administration. He's placed a tariff on imports from China with the goal of forcing the communist nation to assist in halting illegal immigration and keeping fentanyl and other drugs from flowing across the United States borders. But will his strategy work? Joining me to discuss, attorney, author, and Asian affairs expert, Gordon Chang. Gordon, welcome back. I want to start with these tariffs. A day after the president tacked that 10% charge on Chinese goods coming into the United States, China retaliated with a 15% tariff on goods coming from the United States. So China's lodged a complaint now with the World Trade Organization, calling the Trump tariffs discriminatory and protectionist. Gordon, does China have a case? And doesn't China need trade with the U.S. more than the U.S. needs trade with China?
Well, certainly China needs us much more than the other way around. You know, last year, China ran up an enormous trade surplus against us, $295.4 billion in merchandise trade. That's up 5.8% from 2023. Trade surplus countries don't have very much ammunition in trade wars. And by the way, our economy is so much larger than China's, and big economies push smaller ones around. So Xi Jinping, yeah, he can put tariffs on, he can threaten to go to the World Trade Organization, but his retaliatory measures announced on Tuesday, as a friend of mine said, that's weak tea.
Well, Gordon, will the Trump strategy work here, though? I mean, how will these tariffs on U.S. allies like Canada and Mexico, how does that affect the trade war with China?
Well, that could push Canada, for instance, towards China. But also, you've got to remember, China and Canada are actually closer than we are with Canada. And there's some very serious national security threats from Canada. Just to give you an example, although the number of migrants coming across our southern border has been very much in excess of the number of migrants coming across the northern border, those who have been apprehended on the terrorist watch list, there are more than twice of them coming from Canada than from Mexico in fiscal year 2024, which shows you that dangerous elements now prefer the northern route. And that's when the Canadian authorities are just allowing this to happen.
Crazy. This week, the U.S. Postal Service initially suspended all deliveries from Hong Kong and mainland China, but they've since resumed service, saying the USPS and Customs and Border Protection are working closely together to implement an efficient collection mechanism for the new Chinese tariffs to ensure the least disruption to package delivery. Gordon, your thoughts on this, and is this a small win for China?
It certainly is a small win, maybe even a big win for China, because it shows a number of things. It shows either the incompetence of the Trump administration, or it shows that they caved into China's pressure. So take your pick. But clearly the Trump administration did the right thing by eliminating the $800 de minimis exemption for goods from China. That was great. That was really important. But then to have this flip-flop, which was essentially on enforcement, that is really a sign of Trump failure. So, you know, it's not a big deal in a sense, but I think that it really shows that the administration was not prepared to enforce the important measure that they had actually put in place.
Yeah, there's a lot of this back and forth. You know, they say something, and then a few weeks later, they walk it back and say, oh, well, we're working with it, we're negotiating. For instance, the Chinese app TikTok, which was a concern for the United States and for the first Trump administration, I might add. Now, they'd like an American company to buy the app from China, but TikTok's parent company is holding out for negotiations. Last year, Gordon, Joe Biden signed a sell or ban law regarding TikTok. There was nearly a ban. Now we're waiting for some kind of deal to be struck. No matter who owns it, doesn't it still present a danger to U.S. security, given the potential for surveillance in that app?
Yes, well, if an American company owns TikTok, they will administer it. And so therefore, the surveillance aspect is mitigated or eliminated. But what is not eliminated is the curation algorithm, because China said it will not allow a transfer of that algorithm. That's the mechanism by which China disseminates propaganda in the United States, Also, all those videos on illicit drug use, self-harm, fomenting violence on American streets, we cannot allow China to have. And the idea that there would be some 50-50 joint venture with China is completely unacceptable. The Trump administration's actions on TikTok started a narrative that Trump was going soft on China. I don't know if that's true in general, but clearly this was something the Trump administration should not have done because this was wrong from every perspective.
Yeah, I don't know why some new venture doesn't begin in the United States, call it TokTik, and launch an American version of this thing and get everybody to jump off it and incentivize them some way. I mean, it's dancing videos for the most part and cooking lessons and book recommendations. Surely we can do that on our own. We have platforms that can accommodate that. I mean, certainly the administration also has a connection with Rumble and Truth Social. Do something there. Anyway, do you think the Trump suggestion, I got to get into this, we talked about it earlier, that the U.S. occupy Gaza without troops, do you think that will embolden China's goal of reuniting Taiwan that we've been talking about for so long?
That will be the effect. Whatever one thinks about Gaza, the point is that this would be a distraction in resources and focus of America. And we cannot afford that. We've got critical problems, not only at home, but also in the Western Hemisphere. And of course, we have issues with regard to supporting our friends and allies around the world. Gaza is just, I think, a couple bridges too far. And so I think that this was first of all, is a really bad idea. But on the other hand, even if it were a great idea, this is not the right time for us to do something like this.
Yeah. China's also been exerting its influence and control in South and Central America, particularly around the Panama Canal shipping corridor. Now, this week, Secretary of State Marco Rubio visited Panama, and he called for the country to reduce China's influence in the canal zone and in all of Latin America. How much control does China really exert in that region, Gordon? And are Rubio and the president correct in their assessment here?
Yeah, China can choke off the canal anytime it wants to. It can block the waterway. And China is, I think, more influential in Panama than the United States is. There's a lot of history for that, but the point is that China has actually effectively taken over.
Why? Is it financial incentives? What are they doing there that's created that connectivity?
It was men and women in business attire kept coming over with big checkbooks and suitcases of cash and buying off the Panamanian elite. This was our fault. We were not paying attention to what was going on. So you take a look at those two port operations that Hutchison has. Hutchison is a Hong Kong company, but it is subject to the demands of the Communist Party. And in wartime, Hutchison has to do what the party wants it to. In other words, the Chinese military will take over those port facilities, one on the Atlantic side of the canal, the other on the Pacific side. And that's not the only Chinese levers in the canal zone. They can block that canal in so many different ways, Raymond. And so clearly, we have a right to be concerned about China's influence in the canal zone in particular, but also in Panama in general, because China's doing some things in Panama which are really bad. So for instance, China is now building a road through the Darien Gap. That will facilitate migration into the United States. This is really, really bad from our perspective.
And will these actions prove successful for the United States? I mean, are Rubio and Trump on the right track here, or is this too far gone?
Well, nothing's too far gone. I mean, but this will take a long time for us to reverse. And, it's really, people can argue about whether they like Trump's rhetoric about the Panama Canal. But the point is, someone had to raise the issue, and it was to Trump's great credit that he did so. It's also to Rubio's great credit that his first foreign trip abroad as Secretary of State was to Panama and to 4 other Central American and Caribbean countries, which means the Trump administration is prioritizing the Western Hemisphere over hotspots elsewhere around the world. I think that's a very good thing, Raymond, that we're now focusing on the threats to our homeland from areas nearby.
Yeah, no, they've smartly identified the Greenland thing, Panama Canal. If you can't protect your homeland, foreign adventures are of no use. I want to move on to the situation in North and South Korea. Northern Korean troops allied with Russia are in Ukraine now, and the political situation in South Korea is very unstable, with the prime minister now under impeachment. How is this affecting China's dominance in the region, Gordon, particularly with Russia, North Korea, that alliance?
Yeah, first of all, I think that China was the mastermind behind this idea of sending North Korean troops to Ukraine. And that's a very long story, but China has inordinate influence over both Moscow and Pyongyang. And that arrangement could not have occurred, sending the troops to Eastern Europe, without China's say-so. The situation in South Korea is almost critical. And the reason is that China and North Korea are using their influence through the leftists in South Korea. The leftists there, they not only would want to establish a one-party state, they would also want to abolish South Korea. This has been their long-term goal. And now the leader of the leftist party, Lee Jae-myung, is a ruthless, I guess I shouldn't say the word, he's a ruthless figure. And we have to be very concerned that South Korea could become a communist state in a not too distant future.
Yeah. Gordon, we have talked a lot in the past about the security threat presented by our southern porous U.S. border. As you mentioned earlier, we've not talked so much about that northern border between the U.S. and Canada. That is often overlooked, but it's critical. And should we spend more time focused on that, do you think? Especially what you mentioned earlier, the number of terrorists crossing that border.
Yeah, this is important because terrorists and other dangerous elements realize that that border, as we say, is the longest undefended border in the world, and we have not been paying attention to it. Just to give you an example of how bad this is, in February, U.S. Border Patrol in Maine apprehended 3 Chinese nationals trying to sneak into the U.S. under cover of darkness. On the U.S. side was a 4th Chinese national, also a migrant, who was obviously there by prearrangement to help them get in. Now, if you're a desperate person and want to live in a free society, the first thing you do is you find a Border Patrol agent to give yourself up, to get into the asylum system, to get all sorts of goodies from New York City. If you're trying to sneak in, you're coming here for no good. And that is just an example of what is happening across our northern border right now, all the time. Yeah. The Chinese have very influential in Justin Trudeau's political system, and they've taken advantage of it to use it as a sanctuary to assault us.
Before we run out of time, birthright citizenship in the United States has become a major issue since Trump took office. He signed an executive order banning the practice of birthright citizenship. This week, a federal judge put a hold on the enforcement of that executive order. Has birthright citizenship been used by China, Gordon, and other enemies of the United States to weaken U.S. security? And should we be concerned?
Well, Chinese people have used it for sure. I don't know if the regime has used it, but what happens is when you have Chinese migrants in the U.S., China intimidates them, blackmails them, gets them to do all sorts of things, including committing crimes against America. So this is an issue which is really quite broad. There's the constitutional aspects of birthright citizenship, but that's one of the few tools that I think the party has not quite used quite yet. But as I said, Chinese migrants and Chinese nationals in our country, they are subject to a lot of coercion by Beijing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember years ago those birth hotels that were set up, and it was all Chinese nationals coming in and using a lot of those hotels. And there was some speculation that might have been run by the Chinese government. Who knows if those are still, in use, being practiced or not.
One thing we should say that China has run migrants into the U.S., operatives, military agents across our border. That is a real and present danger.
Wow. Gordon Chang, I always learn something when you're on the show. Thank you so much for being here. For all the latest, you can follow Gordon Chang on X at Gordon G. Chang. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Raymond.